Hey, thanks for checking out The Solid Verbal. Now would be a great time to subscribe to the channel for college football content all off season long.
Welcome back to the Solid Verbal, boys and girls. My name is Ty Hildenbrand. Joining me, as always, over there, my beloved co-host in the Midwest, Chicagoland, Dan Rubenstein. Sir, welcome back to preview season. We made it. We
did make it. And starting at the top, Ty, as we all know, starting at the top of college football, the top of mind of college football goes through the West Coast, as we've all come to understand and celebrate. The true capital of the sport that will carry the torch for generations to come, Ty. I'm saying this to not date myself, Ty, because there's stuff that's just universal about the sport, and that is not just the survival, but the thriving of that West Coast college football, Ty. So we got to get it in quickly.
We got to get it in. We're going to Big Ten country, or what I guess I should refer to as soon to be Big Ten country starting in 2024, which is one of the storylines I'm sure we will outline here as we go through. As you mentioned, it's the Pac-12. We're going to talk through all things Pac-12. Going to take a little bit of a different spin on our previews this year. We'll get to that momentarily. Before we do, make sure you hit follow or subscribe, whatever your app of choice allows you to hit. We'd appreciate it. Leave us a star rating or a review if you are ever so inclined. Go on out to verballers.com. That is our Patreon. As of today, Dan, we are rolling out a new game. We're calling it Grand Total. It is a brand new concept. Every team in the Power 5, you've got to give us over or under based on the current line as of now. The winner will get a Solid Verbal prize pack. We're very excited for Grand Total. We talk so much about over-unders just in passing. Now we're going to make a game of it. So that is at verballers.com, verballers.com, if you want to sign on to be a Patreon subscriber and play in that game and all of those to follow.
Yes, this is win totals, over-unders, to be clear, right?
That is correct.
Grand Total is the name of the game. As you mentioned, over-unders. We go through the Power 5 teams, and it's a game to see who has that third eye in the middle of their forehead to predict, I don't know if that's what third eyes are for, to predict the future, and who can nail the most over-unders that will all be tallied, as you mentioned, at the end of the year.
As I said, we're taking a little bit of a different spin this year on our previews.
My goodness. How interesting. How bizarre.
In the past, we've gone through every team, every position group. We've tried to identify strengths and weaknesses. And to be fair, we might still do that.
Yeah.
In the course of our conversation here, I don't think anything we're describing prevents us from doing so. But one of the things that we've come to know and love, and frankly, something that was communicated to us through our beautiful Patreon community, again, at verballers.com, and the fine folks on Discord who chose to respond to my question, people just want to know what to be interested in.
Sure. And look,
what should they be interested in this year?
Just like anybody who's dating somebody who is engaged or married, if I were to ask you right now, Ty, what is it that you love about Kate? You would probably rattle off a series of qualities that she has. That first one that comes to mind is probably the most important, right? No. Where if you just she's just super down to earth and no, just stop there. Because that's what does it for you, right? That you gel with that. That's what piques your interest. So I know we're not fully going into my truffle hunting analogy for the fall preview season, but in a way, we are hunting for the most intriguing narrative, storyline, player, side of the ball, coaching situation, schedule, whatever it is about a team that really makes the hairs on the back of our neck stand up. That's what we're zeroing in on. Here is the fascinating team about blah, blah, blah. And so that's the direction, if I have this correctly.
Fascinating things about the Pac-12 starting right now, Dan. Let's keep tabs. By the time we get to the end of this episode, we'll have a final tally.
Okay.
But number one, I'm not even going to talk about a team. I'm going to talk about the interest, the intrigue, the fascination with two teams leaving next year.
Yeah.
It's the elephant in the room, but USC, UCLA, I talked about it in our intro here. This is sort of their farewell tour. Mm-hmm. And so what comes of that will be interesting to see, right? Both in a sense, I think, feel like they've got a pretty good case for the 2023 Pac-12 season to find their way into the conference championship game. It's not, I think, a stretch to imagine either of those teams finding their way into that game.
Really?
But also,
you think it's not a
possible.
stretch for UCLA? Okay.
It's more of a stretch for UCLA than it is for USC, for sure.
I'm interested to hear you and see you show your work.
But beyond that, Dan, I think both schools are also trying to show out a little bit for their new conference as they go into the Big Ten next season. So that, to me, is one of the more fascinating elements that I think we need to follow this season.
Yeah. Do you think, and maybe I can speak to this better, I don't know. Do you think it's going to be, and we'll get there with the Big 12 in Texas and Oklahoma, do you think there's going to be palpable venom when UCLA and USC are on the road for what they're leaving in their wake with where the Pac-12 stands at time of recording?
No, I don't. I don't think there'll be palpable venom in the same way that there will be for Texas and Oklahoma.
I think there will be for USC. I think the West Coast prerogative, could be mistaken, is USC and Fox got a little cozy and decided, this would be great for each other. And we're going to destroy West Coast football and whatever, so be it. So I think there will be venom for USC just because everybody has baggage with USC. They've been a power, or they've been a perceived power for so long, or at least for the past couple decades in the modern era, that I think there is going to be something when USC travels. I think it's going to be extra vicious by whatever West Coast vicious standards are. I don't think anybody cares about UCLA football. I just don't. In the way that they probably care about UCLA basketball for sure. I just don't think there is going to be animus there.
The other thing here that jumps out to me, number 2, the Pac-12, much like the Big 12, is sort of trapped year in and year out in this version of college football Hunger Games where they basically all try to kill each other.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they succeed. Most of the time they succeed. On rare occasion they don't, and somebody emerges. But it feels to me, in looking through all of the 12 teams in the Pac-12 this season, that we are again headed straight for that reality, where there are a bunch of teams that we all feel really good about, the USCs and the Washingtons and the Oregons, and maybe in my case, the UCLAs. We can go through that here in a bit. But I can't see a world in which one of them emerges completely unscathed. Somebody goes the whole way undefeated, has a clear shot into the playoff. Unfortunately, from where I sit, it feels to me like another year where the Pac-12 has too many teams that knock each other off, and in so doing, they all get left out of the playoff.
Well, I mean, that's certainly one way to look at it. 2, another side of it, I don't know, maybe this is like a Dungeons and Dragons-esque multi-sided die, but is it a situation where because they have the stones to play 9 conference games, which not all conferences do, because they have the stones to do it, that's makes it that much more difficult to, go 11-1 or 12-0 or something like that? Is it an actual matter of, is there a team that is built completely enough that we will in earnest label a playoff-ish team? Maybe, as we discuss this and figure out the fascinating things about the conference. And 2, does it matter? Or 3, does it matter, right? 3, like, if we're looking at this season, which is the swan song as the Pac-12, as we know it, does it matter that, we're looking at a slate of flawed teams? I think, right? There's nobody that is, like, obvious in this moment that they're complete and, worthy of conversation with Ohio State and Michigan and Clemson and Georgia and Alabama and LSU and whoever else. That to me is the issue too, that, we're saying like, well, there might be an obvious playoff team, but they're going to lose twice because that's just what happens in the Pac-12. It's an interesting way to look at it to me. Maybe it's just because I'm looking at it like that right now. But yeah, I sincerely doubt anybody's getting through this unscathed because, again, I don't think anybody is built to go through it unscathed, and nobody ever has, I don't believe. So I'm with you. I'm with you that's fascinating, that this is a conference that's pretty heavy at the top, which is nice, but I don't know what the bottom looks like. What's next?
Any other fascinating things from a high level?
Sure. It's
for you.
I think, and you can 100% disagree, it is the best quarterback major conference right now.
I think that's fair. Completely fair.
With who has left in various conferences, obviously there's questions in the SEC at major places as to not just who's going to start, but how they're going to play. Now this, might be rendered moot by week 7 or something when new quarterbacks come in and thrive in other conferences. But right now, with new quarterbacks coming in at Penn State and Ohio State, and obviously a number of other schools in the Big Ten, ACC, whatever, I think the combination of Michael Penix, Caleb Williams, Cam Rising, and Bo Nix at the top right now appears to be the grouping that is the most proven successful grouping at the top of any conference or major conference, whatever we want to call it. Disagree? Agree?
I think I agree.
There's there's promise everywhere, but right now, especially if we're to believe that we have a continuation of good Bo Nix and healthy Michael Penix, which is also very good, successful Cam Rising, Heisman, Caleb Williams, I think that's an interesting way to start off the season, knowing how top heavy the conference is at quarterback. I have that as an adjacent thing. This is a stacked conference of offensive minds, Ty. Like, you look at the coordinators in this conference or the people in charge of the offenses, whatever. So Lincoln Riley and Chip Kelly are in the same vague city, Ty. They are there. So you have Jed Fish, who did really nice things at Arizona. Kenny Dillingham was one of the best national coordinators last year, has taken over his own program. Andy Ludwig is good to very good. I would argue not excellent, but a lot of teams would take good to very good at offensive coordinator. So he's at Utah and has been successful there. Ryan Grubb turns down a ton of money to stay at Washington and call one of the nation's best offenses. We can talk forever about Jonathan Smith and how much he gets out of his offenses at Oregon State. We'll see on Oregon and Will Stein, but certainly he had a ton of success, and Oregon had a ton of success with what they bring back on offense. Look, Troy Taylor taking over Stanford, they're not going to be good this year, but what he's done with offense is all over the place.
Very balanced, very solid.
Super balanced, always successful, was a high school coach, Utah's offensive coordinator, did a great job at Sac State. I don't know if I'm forgetting it. Sean Lewis
Did you
at
mention
Colorado?
my fascination with Ben Arbuckle at Wazoo?
Ben Arbuckle, what he did at Western Kentucky last year, right? He's 14 years old? He's going to call
Something
the Wazoo
like
offense?
He might be a year older than Kenny Dillingham. Yeah.
The collection of offensive minds is fascinating to me because I just think it's going to be a crazy entertaining year out west. So that to me is super fascinating. I have, again, this is now a subpart of this whole thought, is when you look at the quarterbacks in the conference, who has the most around them? And really hard to tell, right? It's not just, look, USC loses a Blitnikoff receiver and Oregon loses an offensive line in front of Bo Nix. That was sensational. And Washington loses some offensive linemen, whatever. We're going to get into the weeds a little bit more in a bit, but it's just like, who is everybody bringing to the battle lines is a great conversation. And I don't know if it's about who's the best or who's the weirdest or who's the most intriguing or fascinating, but that to me was something. And then we're forgetting, I guess, the biggest thing, unless you want to add to that specifically.
No, I mean, what I think is interesting about that point of view, Dan, is what a lot of the preview publications will do is they'll take a broad look at a conference and they'll grade based on position group, right?
Yeah.
Quarterback, running back, pass catchers, and then they'll do the same on the defensive side of the ball.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll grade them from 1 being the best to 12 being the worst. What's interesting about the Pac-12 is across every single team, even the ones that I think we expect to be pretty good, all of them have at least a 6 somewhere in their line. You don't necessarily see the 6 if you look at like a Georgia or an Ohio State or a Michigan. If you look at some of the other schools that I think we're presuming to be kind of in that top tier of college football this year. But on the Pac-12, that's part of what makes it so interesting. There is kind of like, I don't want to call it a fatal flaw, but a serious flaw on every team that makes them a little bit more interesting.
The other element, the other fascinating thing high level, is something very specific, and that is the Pac-12 is the only conference that includes a team that employs Deion Sanders. And I think that it rises above just like the fascinating thing about Colorado. No conference has a coach that more people will be paying attention to out of sheer curiosity based on Colorado's offseason, Deion's personality, Deion's fame, his notoriety, whatever you want to call it. The Pac-12, if you're going to talk about fascinating elements right now based on national attention, I don't know that somebody in Jacksonville could pick Dan Lanning out of a lineup. But I think people in Saskatoon could pick out Deion Sanders. I love saying Saskatoon so much. So that to me is the coaching curiosity is just at the top of the pyramid to me in terms of fascinating things, because nobody has that other than the Pac-12.
Nobody has that, and it's a perfect segue into Colorado.
Yes.
Why don't I start with Colorado? And look, I agree with you. Interesting thing number 5 here in the Pac-12. The Coach Prime experiment, man.
Yeah.
The Coach Prime experiment. At the risk of picking the lowest of the low-hanging fruit in all of college football, I am most fascinated by how this whole thing with Deion is going to go. And I think there are 2 very obvious angles, most of which have been explored, but perhaps we can unpack them a little bit further. The first is that Coach Prime was hired and instantly made Colorado a national talking point. I think that's a win-win. I know there is some inherent risk here, but I think it's win-win. It's a good job for him because Colorado was pretty much the worst Power 5 team a year ago. Its defense might have been the worst in college football. They were really bad last season. So if ever there were a Power 5 school to jump to from the FCS ranks where expectations would not be an issue, at least not right away, this is it. It's a good move for Deion if he wants to coach the Power 5 level. If you're Colorado, why not take a swing? You know, we've talked a lot in the preseason here about, well, Deion's out for Deion. Right. And it could be 2-3 years down the line where, let's say he cranks Colorado up and then he decides he's going to bolt for a bigger college job or maybe the NFL. Who knows? Still, if you're Colorado, why not take the swing? At least you're out of the basement in 3 years when he decides to leave. That's not a bad place to be. That's the first, I think, angle that a lot of people have brought up, with respect to the Deion hire. The second is, I think, actually the more interesting morsel of the whole Coach Prime thing. And that is that we've got an unprecedented level of roster turnover here. At least 71 of Colorado's 85 scholarship players could be newcomers by the time the season starts. Labor Day weekend. 50 guys transferred out. I've got the sound. I'm not going to play it 50 times. 50 guys transferred out of this thing. And this is the part that's really interesting, again, because I'm just not sure how you handicap this. So much of what we do is based on what a team did last year, what a team's got coming back, what coaches are being assembled to try and crank things up and make things better. But when you have such incredible roster turnover, it's almost impossible to say. Everybody is starting from the same point.
Yeah.
Almost everybody on the roster is starting from the same point. Everybody is a newcomer, to the extent that I wonder, does it just negate the whole returning production thing at all? Like, does it even matter? Should it even be something that we consider coming into this season?
Well, I think there's value in continuity, right? That a lot of teams are starting over at position groups or side of the ball. So there is something about, like, so many teams are new in so many places that it's an advantage when somebody's been in a system for a while and is talented enough to perform in that system. So I still see some contextual advantages there.
It is interesting though, right? Yeah. Like, everybody started from the same spot, and we don't see it that often. Certainly not this level of roster turnover. I want to emphasize that he's assembled a good staff.
Sure.
The top line that everyone wants to talk about with Colorado is, they're starting over, and Deion's got this big personality, and they're bringing in all new guys. He kicked out a lot of the old guys, but he brought in Sean Lewis and Bill Boyle from Kent State. 2 guys who know how to build an offense, know how to build a running game. Bill Boyle is really good at building an offensive line. He brought in Charles Kelly, who won 2 national championships as a defensive assistant. He's a big-time recruiter. These guys know what they're doing, and the fact they signed on with Deion, I think, is meaningful. I'm not sure it's going to get there this year, but I think the fact that they would sign on to be with him at all is sort of telling. I'm not one of the folks who's out here shooting the sunshine, saying that Colorado is making a bowl game this year.
Right.
It's hard to see that for me because it's
name names.
Schedule.
Who is doing that?
Oh, there's some folks out there who have talked about Colorado. Not that many, but a select few who are really, really slurping the hopium when it comes to Colorado. There's a brutal schedule. I don't see that. But it's also not like this is a roster of walk-ons. Much to the extent that the coaching staff, I think, is filled with guys who know what they're doing. Shadur Sanders, coach's kid, was a pretty good FCS quarterback. He's pretty good. And he had some star power coming out of high school. Cavassier Smoke is a name that many listeners of this show will remember from his time at Kentucky. He's pretty good. Travis Hunter.
Great.
Cormani McLean. These are the last top cornerback prospects over the previous 2 recruiting classes. Both are now playing for Colorado. I'm not going to sit here and read names. You get the gist of what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But I do think a feisty, let's say 3-9 Colorado is more interesting than like half the teams in college football.
I guess it depends on how they go 3-9. I guess it can go in any direction. The big thing with Colorado to me is going to continue to be, and you can speak to this further, is going to be the people who weigh more than 280 pounds and how good they are or are not for Colorado. Because you talk about these big names, I think that, especially where Colorado physically is located, that you're not in the Southeast, you're not in the Midwest, you're sort of in between everything. You're not going to produce a ton in state, and you're going to have tremendous athletes. You know, Travis Hunter is maybe the most versatile player in college football with his ceiling on offense as a receiver and certainly what he's proven at corner and what he projects to be at corner. But ultimately, what's to stop teams from going straight at Colorado and just smashing them on the ground? Because the amount of time it takes, and you cannot do it in a season, to build an offensive line and build a defensive line, let alone build offensive line depth and depth along the front 7. You can find speed, you can find talent, you can find instinct, but the size is not super teachable and coachable, and that's something that you build up over time. And the teams, and sure, offensive and defensive linemen hit the portal, but the time it takes to find 10 good offensive linemen who you can develop to do what you want, same goes for defensive linemen, whatever, it's not flip switching. It's just not. And so that to me is going to be the thing that we might see some great individual plays from Colorado on both sides of the ball, but to build up the roster, the quality of a roster that is needed to win 8-9 games in a Power 5 conference, I'm planting my flag today and saying not doable in a single offseason.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how Charles Kelly assembles what is a contingent of transfers, especially in that front 7. I'm looking at the list here. You've got guys from Dartmouth and Fresno and West Virginia and Florida State and Arkansas and Washington. I mean, this really is a melting pot of guys who were either buried on a depth chart elsewhere, saw an opportunity to maybe play at the Power 5 level. Everyone's got their own reasons. The transfer portal was teeming with activity this past offseason.
Yeah.
But it stands to reason that Charles Kelly got his work cut out for him to try and assemble these guys together. I'm not one of these folks who believes that every transfer is going to hit, even that half of your transfers are going to hit.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of impossible. But, you know, if a sizable fraction of these guys end up being better than what Colorado had last year, it's interesting. And I agree with what you're saying. 3-9, how they go 3-9, if they go 3-9, definitely means a lot in whether or not this team is interesting. But if they're feisty, if they're in games late, if they're playing the way some teams have played for new coaches in the past, I think of Dave Aranda as an example, or even the early years of Brian Kelly at Notre Dame, those teams played, and they played hard, and they were in it to win it until the very end, even if more often than not they come up short. I think that's where Colorado has a chance to be interesting, not to make a bowl, but just to push teams.
Right.
And late in the season, when they've got a game, on the road at Utah, late in the season when like Arizona or Oregon State come to town, I'm curious to see what form this Colorado Buffaloes team takes on. I don't know if they're going to be good enough by then to get a win here or there.
Right.
But nonetheless, all of these guys at that point should be gelling and hopefully more on the same page than I presume they are now.
Yeah. And there's the force of personality of Deion Sanders that if things go wrong, does he have the ability? Has he quickly built a culture to right the ship in 3 days if necessary? Will be fascinating to watch, but on the field, I'll echo both of our statements. Is all I'm going to be watching is the offensive and defensive lines early on. That's all I care about, to see if there's fight, if there's talent, if there's depth over the course of the season. It's true of every team, but especially with a team overhauling as much as Colorado has. That to me is just crazy fascinating.
What is the most fascinating thing about Oregon in 2023?
Okay, So good transition, because it's very similar to what we talked about with Colorado, except on a much higher level, because they won 10 total games. They went 9-3 during the regular season last year. But I have it written down here because I am terrible with words, Ty, and I'm pre-apologizing. Eugene hostility. Hostel as in a place to stay for foreigners, because Oregon and Dan Lanning brought in a ton of new faces. They signed a big recruiting class. I think it was pushing around 30 guys, and then added a ton from the portal with a focus on defense, I would say, at all three levels. And so what ultimately took Oregon down last year was, well, not belonging on the same field as Georgia to open the season. And then Bo Nix gets hurt late against Washington, but that was a game in which the defense really struggled defending what Michael Penix was able to do in terms of extending the field with his arm, and was just at a terrific day. Washington ran the ball reasonably well. They couldn't get to Michael Penix, though. That was the big thing. Even when they actually broke tackles or whatever, not broke tackles, but were able to get past tackles or to penetrate the offensive line, Michael Penix was talented enough to evade. And so Oregon had, I think, the single worst year in terms of pressures and sacks in decades. And that wasn't the case just earlier, because Kayvon Thibodeau existed in green and yellow and black and white. And so what Oregon did is they go after Jordan Birch from South Carolina, former 5-star, who I think was scratching the surface of his ceiling. I think maybe there was some disappointment with him in Columbia. They signed a class with, I believe, 10 defensive linemen in it, many of whom were blue chip. They get Justin Jacobs, from Iowa at linebacker, who showed a lot of promise. They overhaul their secondary while losing their best corner in Christian Gonzalez. And so they bring in a safety from Ole Miss, a safety, a younger brother of an Oregon player, a safety from Fresno State. They bring in a corner from Alabama. And so the question now is, there are a number of people who are going to be depended upon to generate more pressure, to be great in coverage, to tackle in the open field, who were not on this team last year. And so with the expectation of where the offense should be, and the Washington game being in Seattle, hosting USC, and whatever happens, you're going to have to score a ton of points to beat USC and get a stop here and there, hopefully, against what should be a supercharged USC offense. That is there enough on this defense over the course of the season? And they built up depth, and there's talent there for sure. I think there's still doubt about Tosh Lupoy as a defensive coordinator and play caller. They have a new co-defensive coordinator they bring in from Tulane, Chris Hampton, who's going to coach the safeties and help to organize this defense. Obviously, Dan Lanning's calling card is defense. But the new faces, the new names, lasting over the course of 12 games. Thankfully, no Georgia on the schedule, but you saw it against Oregon State. They blow that deep lead when Oregon State and Damian Martinez on the ground are able to do whatever they wanted against this Oregon front. Oregon was not fitting gaps. They were not tackling. They were gassed. They were ready to move on to bowl season. And so that to me is the difference, is are there dudes to tackle for 12 consecutive games up front? If so, Oregon's going to win a ton. Oregon will absolutely win a ton. But that's the fascinating thing about Oregon is you hire Dan Lanning, you pay him to come across the country, you pay him to recruit the way that he has. This has to be a top 40 defense if Oregon is going to complete its goals, all right, come anywhere close to it. That to me is incredible. And the other name along that defensive front, if the pass rush is everything and was nothing last year, is Mateo Uiagalelei, DJU's little brother. Flashed in the spring game, 5-star prospect on the edge from Southern California, that he, in concert with Jordan Birch coming in from South Carolina, Brandon Dorlus, who's been there forever and is a very talented defensive lineman, the return of some guys who were beat up last year along the defensive line, and adding freshman depth. Is that enough to make this Oregon defense look completely refreshed and new? That to me is the fascinating question. I think the entire season hinges on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's dangerous to start trying to compare the Oregon defense or the way that Dan Lanning is trying to build it to what he did at Georgia.
For sure.
That's not fair to the guys who are at Oregon. If you're an Oregon fan, you got to be pretty excited about the talent that he's amassed. I mean,
sure,
the defensive line has questions, but it's super deep and talented. How good can it be? We're going to have to reconvene maybe midway through the season and talk about any progress that's been made there. They certainly stand to upgrade across a couple different positions on defense. I mean, that would be great. They were 60th overall in the SP Plus in terms of defense last season, and that's not exactly what I think folks thought they were getting with Dan Lanning. They've gotten the talent part right.
Sure.
It's a matter of now assembling the forces and doing the job on the defensive side. Offensively, I'm actually very curious about the offensive line.
Yeah.
Because 4 new starters, something like that this coming season. They've got a former 5-star who's going to be along the line. They've got a couple transfers that they're bringing in that could obviously help and stem the tide a little bit there, prevent against any kind of drop-off. But this is a team that was pretty good at rushing the football a year ago. I mean, Bo Nix is only one component of it. They should have what I think figures to be a pretty dynamic backfield. And if that line is not firing on all cylinders, that could upset the balance of what I think they're trying to do now in a new Will Stein offense.
They have 3 or 4 guys who played a considerable amount of time last year, but didn't start all the time. And then they hit the portal especially hard. So their presumed starting left tackle was the number 1 tackle in the country 2 recruiting classes
Josh
ago.
Connerly, right?
Josh Connerly. They bring in the right tackle from Rhode Island. He should be playing a Johnny Cornelius. They bring in a longtime starter from Texas, a longtime starter from ECU. They've recruited well along the offensive line. It's new. I think it'll take a little bit of time, but as somebody who pays attention to Oregon, I'm not crazy concerned given the experience, given where the talent level should be, but they also start over sort of at offensive line coach with Adrian Clem leaving for the Patriots, and Oregon brings back a former quality control offensive line, analyst type to Alik Terry from the Minnesota Vikings to coach the offensive line. So that with a new coordinator, with Bo Nix's history of being inconsistent, but then you couple it with what should be a very deep receiving core. They had a USC transfer. They added a ton at receiver. They're thinner at tight end than I think the Oregon coaches would like, but they go 4 deep at quality, if not very, very good running backs. So I think the defense will be counted on more for Oregon to be successful, but the offense has an incredibly high ceiling if the line and Will Stein, new coordinator, come together nicely.
In the spirit of our game grand total,
yeah,
Oregon's over-under is 9.5. Would you go over or under?
I think over.
Yeah.
I think there are 2 losses because of Utah and SC and Washington. It's just an Oregon State. I think there's too much quality and there's too much that's up in the air. But at its best, meaning the defense comes together nicely and the offense gels quickly. They have Texas Tech early on the road. I think this is an 11-1 team.
Let me move over to Corvallis.
Okay.
And let me tell you what fascinates me about Oregon State. I know what you're going to say because we did compare notes. Here's what fascinates me. Damian Martinez.
Yeah.
Damian Martinez might be the best running back in the conference. Damian Martinez will have a really solid line to run behind. That aspect of what I think Jonathan Smith and Oregon State want to do this year makes what you're about to talk about with DJU all the more intriguing, to have kind of that counterbalance. And it's not going to all be on DJU in the same way that it was at Clemson. That's why this conversation that we're about to have about DJU is so intriguing, I think, across the country, and not just you and I, because there is sort of that support net that, they can still build a balanced offense, upgrade their quarterback position, and, I think reasonably expect that things are going to improve.
So to me with Oregon State, it's a question of, because look, they win 10 games. They demolished Florida in a depleted Florida team in the bowl game. They're basically not out of any games other than I think the Utah game, I want to say. All their losses are super close. They beat impressive teams. They beat Oregon, the in-state rival. That the question to me is, what was the reason for it last year, and can that carry over? Now, the reason for it last year to me was this was probably the second most complete team in the conference, in that both offense and defense were reasons for winning football. And right. USC has the offense, Oregon has the offense. Utah was balanced, but otherwise it's just Oregon State, in which the defense, especially in that secondary, they had corners who were smothering. We saw Caleb Williams was lost against Oregon State last year. The defensive front for Oregon State got after Caleb Williams. And so to me, the fascinating thing about Oregon State is, are they a balanced team once again? I say probably not. I think the defense is going to take a step back. I don't think they're going to be a disaster like they were before then. But to me, it's going to be, how much good DJU do we get? We had this conversation with Bo Nix last year ahead of his season with Oregon. It's Jonathan Smith, who I think anybody who's watched Oregon State holds in incredibly high regard as a developer of quarterback talent, as an identifier of offensive scheme that fits his talent. It's, does he have the ability to harness the force or rebuild the force in DJU so that he's confident, that he's able to execute, that he learns, that he is thriving in an offense in which he is not asked to run the ball a ton, or I don't even think he's going to be throwing the ball downfield a ton. Oregon State develops tight ends super well. They develop offensive linemen super well. And now they have Damian Martinez to lean on. So I think it's a matter of, if Oregon State is going to be a play action threat on offense because of Damian Martinez, when DJU rolls out, when he keeps the ball on play action, is he confident in his ability to hit the tight end curling 14 yards down the field or whatever? Is the timing there? Is there gelling between Jonathan Smith and DJU? If indeed DJU is the starter, which we assume he is. But look, Ben Gulbranson won a bunch of games last year. Or was the quarterback on a team who won? He was not the reason they won. He was the reason maybe they didn't lose. But that to me is the fascinating thing. That presumed starter DJU, is this fresh start something that he can thrive in, that he's not going to be in his head across the country as the number one overall, whatever this, that he can just go and play straightforward football on a winning team. And so to me is the thing.
The galaxy-brained version of this question is not what version of DJU we get at Oregon State. It is, what was the real reason for the version of DJU we saw at Clemson? Was it the offense? Now, if you read any of DJU's comments, he gave an interview that I thought shed some light on the situation at Clemson. He talked about how the system didn't really make sense to him, how he didn't feel like he was being utilized well, how he was hurt for a good chunk of the season, but didn't really want to give in, et cetera, et cetera. There were obviously factors with that offense a year ago that didn't seem to bode well for him. Mm-hmm. Clemson, by the way, got rid of the old guy and hired Garrett Riley in the offseason. So Dabo Swinney was feeling the heat on that front as well. Certainly. Or is it a DJU thing? Remember when DJU burst onto the scene? It seemed as if he was going to be the heir apparent, that he was going to be like, I don't know, the next Trevor Lawrence. Maybe not quite to that extent, but following in the footsteps in the way that he did, the early part of his tenure at Clemson seemed really, really promising. And then suddenly we saw the step back. So is it a DJ thing? Is it an offense thing? Perhaps this season is going to shed a little bit more light on that. I think you're wise to bring up the losses on defense. And that for me is really the big question, the X factor in a sense for Oregon State. When we did the schedule preview a couple months ago, we can link to that in the notes here. Oregon State's schedule is not necessarily horrible. They miss
workable. SC. Yeah.
It seems very, very workable. Their over-under is 8.5, which seems to point to at least some uncertainty on the defensive side with what they're going to get on that side of the ball. But this is a good team, and provided they can build that balance again on offense and not take too big a step backwards on defense against 90th in returning production, I think Oregon State stands to have a really good season, and I'm excited to see what DJU can do. I mean, he is probably, just zooming out across college football, one of the 5 most interesting storylines to watch overall.
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely it is. Look, it's DJU and whoever's coming in new on defense, because this was maybe the best pass defense in the Pac-12 last year. Kind of out of nowhere, at least to me. Those corners were incredible, and those corners are gone.
Where do you want to go next?
I think we go with USC here, just because we've mentioned them already so many times, and you have the returning Heisman winner and the final season for USC out west in the Pac-12. So I ask you, on a team stacked with fascinating storylines, which was the item that rose to the top for you?
Yeah, I mean, USC, the item that rises to the top for me is Caleb Williams against his own defense, which is really going to be the storyline. It's going to be the storyline. It's the point of fascination with USC that I think we need to talk about if we're being honest here. Well, the other aspect, I'm not going to hit the ding for this, that I find interesting about USC, and it's always interesting when any team kind of gets to this level, but we always joke about the USC hype train, and Texas has a hype train, and Notre Dame and Michigan and Ohio. Everybody's got their own hype train. But the USC hype train in particular is one that we've had a lot of fun with. It used to be like the Polar Express, where only the true believers could actually see it. This year, it's actually a thing.
Sure.
For those of us on Earth One over here kind of trying to live in reality, it's actually a thing because of Caleb Williams. Caleb Williams needs no introduction, won the Heisman, 52 total touchdowns, 4,500 passing yards, presumably the top pick in the 2024 NFL draft. He's going to have pinball numbers in year 3 under the Lincoln Riley system. We already know this.
Yep.
The supporting cast around him is also comically loaded. But to an extent, and Bill Connolly mentioned this, his words, not mine, to an extent, the supporting cast kind of doesn't even matter because it's Caleb Williams.
Yeah.
It's a Caleb Williams show. It's whatever he does, that's what USC does. The sub point here that I'm very curious in, just as a bit of an aside, is the offensive line losing a couple All-Americans. USC had trouble protecting Caleb Williams last season. And though it could be highly entertaining if he's constantly on the run, because we know he thrives in that type of setting, it also seems like that could be detrimental, not just to his health, but the overall project afoot here at USC, if they're not able to keep him upright and protected so that he can make plays more comfortably. But all that being said, we know what he's going to do, generally speaking. And why I am so interested in that contrast is because the schedule is difficult in its own right. When we talked about the schedule a few months back, we highlighted a tough stretch of games, the Fettuccine Alfredo in October and November for USC. The secondary concern, I would say, for me is, this defense is much in the same way, similar to what we would used to talk about with Lincoln Riley at Oklahoma. And it was, if they can get marginally better, how much better will the team be? Just marginally better.
Yeah.
They don't need to be the 85 Bears out there, Dan. They just need to be a little bit better than they've been. Will they be better?
Yes.
I don't know. I think they will.
Come on. None of this I don't know stuff. Come on. Plant some flags.
I think they will be better.
Okay.
I think they will be better. But I think the contrast, because Caleb Williams is so good, will never be on better display. And last season, we didn't really know what we were signing up for with Lincoln Riley and USC and all these transfers. There was an unprecedented amount of roster turnover there, too.
Right.
And I think it turned out pretty well. The defense, still a problem. But this season now, knowing what we've got to work with, what Lincoln Riley tried to do was boost the defense with transfers. They were very aggressive in the portal. They had something like 7 transfers come in from Power 5 rosters to try and plug the gaps and beef up the defensive line. Anthony Lucas, a big name, comes over from Texas A&M. Bear Alexander was a really big get for the Trojans in the transfer portal, comes over from Georgia pretty late in the cycle. A lot of hushed, revered tones about Bear Alexander. Could he be the behemoth that USC needs in the middle to eat up space and to go to the next level with this thing? And the Bear helps, but I can assure you that it'd help a lot more if this unit weren't 123rd in tackle success rate last season. To me, the real fascination is not just that contrast, but also, is this a coaching problem or is this a talent problem? I think we've gotten to the point now with USC on defense where we can root out talent. Like, if they don't tackle this year, it's probably a coaching thing. Either the guys
I think it can be both. I think it can be both.
Stink,
yeah,
and everybody missed on them in the recruiting rankings and otherwise, or it's a scheme or a coaching thing where they're not teaching fundamentals, not putting them in a position to succeed. That contrast to me between the Heisman Trophy winning quarterback and the defense that just needs to be a little bit better, which is really the broken record story for Lincoln Riley everywhere he's been. Just marginally better makes USC potentially a playoff contender. I'm not sure I truly buy that. but that's where we're at.
We're both guilty of it, where like a team is catastrophically bad at something and you're like, just be okay. Like, well, it might be very hard for them to be okay. They might not have the guys to be okay. USC, as you mentioned, look, I think Mason Cobb is another valuable addition in the linebacking core from Oklahoma State. I think they're going to have more good guys on defense. I think the issue is, well, I think it's still going to be depth in that front seven. They haven't recruited like they want to field a terrific, both in the portal and in high school. They haven't recruited like they want a top 40 defense. And employing Alex Grinch is to employ a defensive coordinator who, at his best, builds a defense around speed and shifts and confusing quarterbacks and forcing turnovers. Admirable things. They're great. But if you're not recovering fumbles, if every fumble isn't bouncing your way, like it did for like 10 of the 12 weeks last year, and you are not intercepting quarterbacks at will to change the complexion of the game. Again, it's great. It's a positive thing. Don't get me wrong. If you are able to field a defense that confuses and turns over quarterbacks all the time, you're doing something right. They finished first on offense in avoiding 3-and-outs nationally. They were the number one offense at avoiding 3-and-outs. On defense, in terms of an ability to get off the field and force 3-and-outs, they were 120th in the nation. And so you are spot on that there is that difference of, is this a defense capable of doing the medium things to succeed, right? To falling into the correct zone on a passing down, to getting after the quarterback, picking the correct times to blitz. And look, let's oversimplify. Defense is about your guy beating their guy. USC does not have enough guys capable of consistently winning our guy versus your guy battles. And so here we are.
Yeah, it was one of the things that I remember in the build-up to last season when we talked to people who were more familiar with the USC roster. It was one of the points that came up. There's skill talent. Obviously, Caleb Williams is all-world everything, won the Heisman. But defensively, who's that guy? Who's the guy in the middle of that line who's going to eat up space?
So maybe Barry Alexander. Yeah,
maybe it's Barry Alexander this year. I don't know.
Yeah.
But they didn't have that physicality on defense, and that's part of why, like Utah, for example.
Yeah.
Utah would give USC trouble. Do you want to go to Utah next?
Man, I think Dalton Kincaid is still catching passes in this USC secondary.
Here's what fascinates me about Utah.
Okay.
Why do we do this every year with Utah? We do the same thing every year with Utah.
Okay.
I think it's fascinating that every year we're always skeptical about Utah.
Well, we're dumb. That could explain part of it.
We are dumb. We're self-aware enough, at least to point out that we're doing it, to realize that we're doing it again. At least I am. And even with all that said, we're still going to remain skeptical.
Mm-hmm.
We're still going to, what the hell is wrong with us, Dan? Utah is the back-to-back defending Pac-12 champion.
Sure.
Clearly, they have done something correctly. I spent some time kind of in my own head trying to figure out, why is it that we get to this place every single year? And I think it stems from a couple different factors. The first is, at least this season, the quarterback situation is at least a bit in limbo. With Cam Rising rehabbing a torn ACL, hurt it in the Rose Bowl. It sounds like he'll be back and ready for fall camp. I know we've been very skeptical of that. He seems very optimistic that he'll be there. That being said, he's going to need to be 100% out of the gates, because point two is that the schedule starts tough and it stays tough the whole way through. They start with Florida and Baylor right out of the gates. If Cam Rising is not 100%, there's not much wiggle room, especially for some of the new contributors on this team. You see that reflected, I think, in the 8.5 over-under. I think that's where it comes from. There is injury concern. There is schedule concern. This is I joke when we did the schedule preview that they're still scheduling as if they're trying to get into a Power 5 conference. Who did this to them? Why did they do this? This is a tough schedule.
Man.
This is a tough schedule. This is why the public right now is, I think, crushing the under. And the third point, and I think the real reason why people are always skeptical about Utah, is stylistically the Utes are very different from other teams that we would get quote unquote excited about, right? We just talked about USC and Caleb Williams. Obviously there's some flash there. Last season, Caleb Williams had Jordan Addison, his first round draft pick, right? A Biletnikoff award winner. Utah had what? 2 really good tight ends.
They did. And now they have 1.
2 good tight ends, a beast of a line on both sides. these are not the typical things that I think the national conversation is drawn to, but it's obviously worked out really well for Kyle Whittingham. This is a 10-4 team a year ago. Honestly, I think it's the style thing with Kyle Whittingham. It's the style points. They don't have the flash. They don't have the shock and the awe of a USC or of an Ohio State or some of these other schools that we typically would group together at the top. And for that reason, maybe not among Utah fans, but among fans that probably don't watch as much Pac-12 football, let's be honest, this is why Utah gets overlooked. I'm going to try not to do it this year. I'm still going to end up doing it.
Okay.
Because I don't fully know how I feel about this team. But the facts are that Utah is 16th in returning production this season. Most of the two deep from 2022 is back. The bedrock for this team is that physical brand of football. It does run counter to most of the peers. Not as many peers in the Pac-12 as before, but still on the whole, it's different than many of the other schools that they're up against. That part is intact. That mentality is still intact, and I think it will probably serve them well as it has for the past however many years now under Kyle Whittingham. There are some key losses on defense, namely Clark Phillips in the secondary, but I still think this is the best defensive line, linebacking core, maybe even secondary in the conference. They're still in a really, really good spot on the defensive side of the ball, despite the fact that there are some key losses. Part of the trouble last year, as you know, was the defense was young. It took them a bit to get going, but once they did, they were pretty good. And this year, it's like 11 of 15 defenders are back from that school. So I think they'll be pretty good again on defense. I think they'll remain physical on both of the lines. 3 linemen are back from an offensive line that was pretty physical last year. Jaquindon Jackson in the backfield, I think the converted quarterback, right? He's a load to bring down.
He's ridiculous.
Like
he was
6'2", 225 is a big deal.
Super fun against SC last year.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Brant Keithy is the remaining tight end who returns from injury this season. It seems like he will again be kind of the gravitational player around which Andy Ludwig builds the offense. Out wide, I think they've got a chance to develop some big play threats. We started to kind of see that happen towards the end of the year last year as they were able to generate a little bit more in the big play department. Still wasn't great, but I think that's an area where they could see some improvement this season. So, the fascination for me with Utah is this is a really good team. And due to the schedule or the style or any number of injury concerns, what have you, that's the reason why we're again sleeping on the Utes. But if you talk to me 6 months from now and we're talking about Utah as a three-peat champion of the Pac-12, none of us should be surprised because they're that level of good should they get everything aligned.
Yeah, I mean, look, they've been able to win without an explosive offense, which is very difficult to do, which is to say they play discipline, they're well coached, and they do what they do on offense, running the ball, Cam Rising making good decisions, utilizing and developing tight ends, finding receivers occasionally. They do that better than everybody defends it. And that's right. You just have to be faster than the guy next to you if you see a bear.
That's right.
And so be it Bear Alexander or real bear, I hate myself for going there, Utah is going to succeed. They were young last year. They made a bunch of mistakes early on in the season last year. They got better. Now they lose key guys, but they bring a ton back on defense, like you mentioned, and they play defense better than basically everybody they play plays offense. Now, can they beat teams in multiple ways? No, they cannot. But they seem to beat enough teams doing it the Utah way where, sleeping on them, doubting them, wondering if they're going to hit 8.5 games, wondering if they're going to be back in the conference championship game, kind of seems silly because they just seem like they're built to do it more often than not.
Yeah, and they're certainly built to beat USC, at least the former version of USC that lacks some of that physicality at the point of attack. Sure. If Utah, again, I have no reason to think Utah won't do that again. That's just sort of what Kyle Whittingham does at this point. The book is kind of out on what Utah is as a program, and it's been very successful. So it's just fascinating that we always paint ourselves into this corner with Utah of not taking them seriously, of maybe being drawn to the bigger star or the flashier offense when they've just been super consistent.
Can we go to another contender? Obvious contender, the one obvious contender we haven't mentioned yet?
I might be in on Washington, Dan.
Okay. I'm going to give you your time. I might be in on Washington. Let's see how I land this plane.
Yeah, I mean, here. This is number 12, by the way. We're going to go way over 12 interesting things, fascinating things in the Pac-12.
Great.
Over-under is 9.5 for Washington. I'm inclined to go under. There's a lot back on both, or over, excuse me. There's a lot back on both sides of the ball. The schedule sets up pretty well. It does get dicey in November, but obviously could be a lot worse. The Oregon game's at home. I just feel like this program is in a really solid place, that Kalen DeBoer got them to a point of stability very quickly. Obviously, there are things that need to be improved. We talked, in the preseason about how there are some challenges on the recruiting side that they need to solve, what have you. But at least given where they're at now with roster construction in 2023, so much of what made them good last year is back that it's hard to see too much of a drop-off, even if some position groups aren't as good as they were last year.
It's buffered, as you mentioned, it's buffered really well until the end of the season when they have, if I'm seeing this correctly, USC, Utah, and Oregon State in consecutive weeks before the Apple Cup. So if what we say is true about, lose close before you win big, Washington did a really, really nice job of winning close last year. And some of those endings of the games they won were a little bit weird, were up in the air. Washington came to play. Washington got key stops when it mattered most. Be it against Arizona, be against Oregon State, be against Oregon, whoever. Washington had a season that I'm positive completely overreached what any of the most optimistic Washington fans could have expected last year. Yeah. So if we're to believe that you win close before you win big, and you return what Washington returns, my fascinating thing about the Huskies is literally a theme of huskiness. And so it's the meaty middle, which we generally use to describe schedules, but it's the meaty middle of their offensive line. It's the meaty middle of their defensive line. It's the meaty middle of the defense in that the linebacking core, where they have some replacing and questionable talent to address. They get healthier in the secondary. They have crazy good receivers. They should be fine at running back. They're not a running team, so I don't know how much that actually matters that much. And if Michael Penix is upright and the line in front of him keeps him upright as much as it did last year, which was a major, major deal with how clean Michael Penix was able to stay in Seattle as compared to Bloomington, they should win a ton of games. As you mentioned, the schedule's fine. I guess it's also the meaty middle of the back half of the schedule with when they play the tougher parts of their schedule. But they were not good on defense last year. They were beat up in the secondary. They get healthier. They bring in a key corner, I think, from Oklahoma State, Jabbar Muhammad. So they should be noticeably better on defense, which is not even to mention Braylon Trice and ZTF, maybe the best edge rushing duo in the conference, if not the country. So they're in a good place at a lot of spots on the field. Now the question is, spotlight's on them. Offseason expectations have been on them for 9 months. Is this a team that is mentally there to build upon an unexpectedly successful year? It seems like they have the bodies on both sides of the ball to do so, especially if there is not a crazy transition along the inside of this offensive line. My only concern with Washington is maybe those close wins are close losses this year. Maybe they're not fully ready and fully built or fully have the depth. I think their one deep is very, very good. My question is if a left guard goes down, an outside linebacker goes down, Asa Turner or whoever goes down in the secondary. Like, that was the issue last year, that as soon as somebody went down, especially on defense, you knew exactly who to pick on. And the way Oregon marched down the field on them, the way Jaden DeLora threw on them, there were issues along for Washington, especially on defense, where you're just like, man, I don't know if they're correcting this in a year. And so that to me would be the concern. Now, they won those games. And we say, win your clunkers. Defense got pushed around against Oregon, won the game. They were the better team. They got Jaden DeLora, again, threw all over them. Michael Penix was even better. And so that's the issue is, are those 50-50 breaks going to go their way again? I hope so, because it would benefit the Pac-12, but that would be the concern because they're in a good spot in a lot of places on this field. So the meaty middle is, for me, where Washington That's where the fascination lies.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point about the one deep. The top line starters figure to bring a lot to the table.
Yeah.
And, I'm looking at efficiency numbers now from a defensive standpoint, success rate, 3-and-out percentage, all of these numbers are terrible.
Yeah, and they were beat up
last season.
They were absolutely
and they're beat up
more than usual, I would say. They had some big injury issues.
I don't have any great reason to expect that those numbers would stay where they're at. I think there's a pretty good chance that they're going to improve. They're really bad against the pass, especially against the pass last season. And, that can stem from a variety of factors, but certainly in a conference that, as we mentioned at the top, has a really good quarterback play, they're going to have to get that in order. If they want to actually get this thing amped up and hit that over 9.5, defending the pass is going to be pretty important.
Yeah. And also, honestly, generating some bigger plays with Michael Penix. And I just hesitate to fully buy in. I think there's probably more to like about Washington than most teams in this conference, but it's how many different ways can they win? And are you going to be able to win with air raidy short stuff on offense in the passing game? Because they did hit bigger plays down the field in spots, at times, in specific moments. They were not a team that I think fully stressed everybody out downfield with the way that offense was constructed. And so if teams get better about keeping the Washington offense in front of them, and look, Washington marched down they had 10, 12, 14, 18 play drives or whatever, and that's great. But that's more opportunity to screw up and get a procedural penalty or turn the ball over or have a miscommunication, whatever. So does Washington have that, that fourth pitch, as we like to say, where it's Jalen Polk up the seam, it's McMillan, it's Roma Dunze, whoever is all of a sudden keeping two high safeties because of how dangerous they are. They didn't always do it last year.
Yeah, I think there's a really good chance that through the first 6 weeks of the year, Washington's undefeated. Then it gets notably harder.
Yeah.
Oregon, the game's at home, as we said.
Great.
They're on the road at USC, come back home against Utah, go back on the road against Oregon State. That's in November. So it will toughen up here in the second half of the season, second half of the schedule here. But I like this team a lot. I'm trying to pump the brakes here because I really do believe in Kalen DeBoer. I've been a Kalen DeBoer fan since he was at Indiana.
Sure.
There is a question, though, about the defense. And is that going to improve even though they've got guys coming back? Can't always assume that.
Okay. Who's the next best quarterback after that big 4, 5, whatever, if you want to include DJU? Is it Jaden DeLaura? Is it whoever's at UCLA?
I think it's Jaden DeLaura.
Okay.
I think it's Jaden DeLaura if you want me to talk about Arizona.
I'd love to. What's your fascinating thing about the Cats?
Man, I love the Cats this year. I love the Cats.
Don't do it to yourself, Ty.
No. I don't love the Cats to go 7-5 or
I know.
go on some sort of miracle run here.
We all remember your ASU wildcard Pac-12 pick last year. We all remember.
Thank you, Dan. It's a bold strategy, Cotton.
Yeah.
Let's see if it works for him. That's what's interesting for me about Arizona.
Okay.
I quote dodgeball because Arizona's defense last season was cataclysmic. It was so bad. 126th in SP+. They gave up almost 37 points per game.
Yeah.
And so Jed Fish did the college football thing that I think I love the most.
He did the thinkable.
The thinkable. Thank you. My absolute favorite move is when a coach does this, when they look out, they understand the reality of the situation, and then they make the boldest move. In this case, he decided he was just going to play a bunch of freshmen. Why kid yourself at that point? The defense is already terrible. You're trying to build this thing long-term, not just for the immediate future. Let's get reps for some of the young guys. And so that's what he did. 7 true freshmen played. This is about midway through the season. 7 true freshmen played more than 50 snaps. 4 played more than 200. Now you fast forward to 2023. All of that experience is back. They added in transfers like the walking targeting violation, as you referred to him, Justin Flo, former 5-star Justin Flo.
Yeah, for sure. And his brother who transferred there, yeah.
And his brother, a handful of other 4-stars that came from around the Pac-12. I don't think Arizona's defense is going to be good in 2023, But I do think there's a universe in which it is significantly better because they bring all that experience back and because the growing pains of last year are now going to be a little bit more worked out in 2023. So again, will they be good? Absolutely not. But if the defense is going to be better this season, they're all going to be back in 2024 with like 95% returning production again, which doesn't mean everything. But I think this is just a really like heady way for Jedd Fisch to build a defense. That is the point of fascination with Arizona. Frankly, it is a defensive thing. When he stepped foot on campus, he knew he inherited a bit of a tire fire. So the first thing he was trying to do was make the offense better, which he did dramatically last season. When he took over, he wanted to get a guy like Jaden DeLauro. He got him, threw him in there last season. It was a big jump. His connection with Jacob Cowing and Dorian Singer, who now is transferred, of course, to USC, to Tyro McMillan, T-Rex, our boy. We love T-Rex here. His connection with those guys was pretty profound.
Are you calling him T-Rex?
T-Rex.
Is that what his
T-Mac.
nickname is?
I've seen T-Rex. I believe T-Mac.
Yeah. No,
more
I'm
of the
okay
common
with
parlance. But either way,
yeah,
we love the guy.
Yeah.
They went from 1 win to 5 wins. They beat USC. They beat Arizona State.
UCLA. Yeah.
UCLA. Beat UCLA. They beat Arizona State. Take back the Territorial Cup. I think a very successful campaign. They'll be sound offensively again, which leads me to my second point of fascination.
Okay.
They're going to upset somebody, right?
Yeah, they did it with UCLA on the road last year late. Sure.
They're going to upset somebody. The defense, I think, is going to be just a little bit better. The offense is going to remain playing at a really high level. The interest is in who of Washington, Oregon State, UCLA, and Utah, all of which are in Tucson. Which of those schools is going to go down to Arizona? That Utah game is a week before the Utes play Washington.
Mm-hmm.
Arizona is also on the road at USC. It's a week before USC goes to Notre Dame.
Okay.
In middle October. I got to believe Arizona stands to ruin someone's season in 2023. The offense is there. If the defense improves a little bit, if you catch somebody in a weird spot, they did it last year. Whose season are they going to ruin, Dan?
I mean, but it's sort of a question of like, whose season is Cliff Kingsbury's Texas Tech going to ruin, right? Where it's just like, well, it's cool that you won this, but are you built in an extremely flawed way? No, I mean, they can beat any of those teams. We saw them come close to all of those teams last year,
right.
I believe, and the teams you mentioned.
Exactly right.
So I don't know what's necessarily better about the defense this year. I think they went through a stretch in the middle of the year where they gave up like 50 points a game.
It was really bad. It was really bad. But here's the thing, okay?
Yeah.
The thing about the strategy, the bold strategy, Cotton, if you will, the thing about it is they played all these freshmen, and initially it was really bad. Like, obviously, it was really bad. It did start to improve down the stretch. It did get better. I don't know if that was by virtue of the competition. I don't know if that was by virtue of the reps. But the reps will travel now into 2023. And whatever position they were starting from last season is infinitely better now because of those reps and because of some of the transfers that they brought in. I know you don't think super highly of Justin Flo, but
sure, he's an improvement over what they had. Yeah,
he's an improvement. Yeah, to add him to what they had before only helps to make them a little bit better. So I think defensively it'll be marginal improvement. I think offensively they'll still be fun to watch. They were fun as hell to watch last year. Arizona's a really interesting school. Their over-under, for what it's worth, is 5. I want to believe in 6. I don't see 6. I don't see a way in which they get to 6 unless the defense is just lights out and way better than anybody could have predicted. But I think if nothing more, this will be a very entertaining team that is worthy of all of our dings here on the preview show.
So one of the problems with which I think is not wrong, but it's just a flaw in the like, well, we're bad, we might as well play the freshmen. The question then is, are those players good players though?
Well, that's the Bill Connelly question, right? And that goes back to something that we talked about on the last Brew and A that we did.
Because good freshmen play well.
Good freshmen play well. Yeah.
They're not finished products.
Not finished products. Well, we talked about on the Brew and A, which you can get at verballers.com, is somebody asked us what are the tropes that we see in the college football preseason are the ones that kind of bother us the most. And the one that I answered was, it bothers me when folks rely too heavily on returning production as any kind of tell for what is to come.
Right.
It doesn't matter as much if the guys stink.
Right.
If they're all back. Bill Connolly's been making that point for years. I happen to believe that this is still something of an unfinished product with the freshmen at Arizona. And though I agree with you, they should play better if they're actually any good.
Right.
I still think having all those reps and all that experience puts them in a much better spot than they were in last season.
Okay. I hope so. One would think. That's the conventional wisdom. But the problem is if they're not very good players, they're going to be super experienced. And super experienced does not wrap up in the open field necessarily. Super talented does. Super experienced doesn't, let a player get behind him in a dramatic third down situation, whatever. So, or super experience can. So that's the problem, is experience does not mean production. And that would be my worry with Arizona, where I don't necessarily see a roster of players capable of fielding a top 50 defense in the near future.
What interests you about Cal and Stanford?
Almost nothing about Cal. Let's be honest.
All right, so I won't ding. I won't play any ding.
No. The fascinating thing is it's essentially a question of all Justin Wilcox has to do is get back to Justin Wilcox. All he has to do is field a dangerous, swarming defense, even if there's no offense to speak of or offensive consistency to speak of. I think it's been 5 years since he's had a top 75, 80 offense nationally in points per drive. And so I'm not going to sit here and say well, Jake Spavital's coming over and he was there in 2016 with Davis Webb and Sonny Dykes. And so he has an understanding of the situation. It's Sam Jackson the fifth coming in from TCU, or maybe it's maybe his last name is Sam Jackson V, but I read that as Sam Jackson the fifth, coming in from TCU, a former blue chip quarterback. And there's some talent. They lose a top receiver to UCLA, but Jeremiah Hunter's back. There's, Jaden Ott ran for, 573 yards against the aforementioned very promising Arizona defense, the youth of Arizona. The question to me is are there just enough guys? I know they're getting healthier on defense. They make changes on both sides of the ball on the coaching staff. They just need a top 30 defense. And if they have that, then they're going to a bowl game. But I don't know if they have that. They were god awful last year on defense. And so if a Justin Wilcox team is awful on defense, beat up, whatever, it happens to everybody, but he just doesn't have the roster to survive injuries. What's the point of having Justin Wilcox?
No.
What are you paying Justin Wilcox money for if you don't have a defense? And so he makes a ton of bad hires at offensive coordinator. That doesn't work out. They can't find a and I think a lot of this is just Berkeley is an impossible place to win, honestly. Right now in this era, it's just an impossible place to build a 9-win team consistently, or a 7-win or 8-win team, whatever. So if you can find and develop defensive players into NFL caliber talent, which he's done for the duration of his time there, they're interesting and fascinating, whatever adjective we want to use. But I don't know. They don't have the guys on offense. I don't think they have the linemen on either side of the ball to disrupt enough teams to win more than 4 or 5 games this year. I just don't. And they're a clear team of, lost a bunch of close games, but I don't know. They weren't built to win close games. So it doesn't really affect me that much.
Yeah. I mean, something that I think we called out at some point when we did other preseason coverage about the Pac-12 and Cal especially is new offense now. They want to play quicker. Is it good to play quicker if the offense stinks?
No, it can be a weapon. It can be tempo
it can be a weapon, but it
can
can also put the defense in a really stressful position that makes it almost impossible for them to succeed. So that's fascinating. Here's the fascination point for me on Cal.
Yeah.
They're the California sandwich company, Dan.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're sandwiched in between Utah and USC for Oregon. They're sandwiched in between Utah and UCLA for Oregon State. Sandwiched in between Utah and Washington for USC. It's an open face sandwich for Utah a week before they play USC. And they're also sandwiched in between road games for Washington at Michigan State and at Arizona. So Cal finds itself in some interesting schedule situations. It's not quite Texas Tech from a year ago, but it's very easy to overlook this team, and they're going to play quickly. And maybe they catch somebody who knows. Their over-under is 5. I think I said at the time we did our schedule preview that I'd put one mortgage payment on the under for Cal.
Wow.
I don't see them getting to 5. That probably means they'll get to 7. But that being said, it seems like it's really tough sledding for Cal. What about Stanford, Dan? Speaking of tough sledding, do they have any players?
Not really. We got Emmitt Smith's kid in the backfields. They return a receiver or two. They lost like their entire offensive line to the portal. They lost a ton on defense to the portal. There's playmakers on defense. There's just not guys on this roster. And I think Troy Taylor is going to be a very good coach for Stanford. I don't know what that means. I mean, win 8 games a year or something. That's great. They're going to recruit pretty well with him, as they've started to do already in year 1 of his first class. Yeah. But no, with the guys on the roster today, I think winning 4 games, it would be borderline miraculous. I think it's going to be a tough first year. But that said, with what he did at Sac State when they didn't have a lot of success, I think he's a really good coach. I think he would. Yeah. He may have been Jake Browning's high school coach, I want to say, in Folsom, when Jake Browning threw for 75 touchdowns his senior year or something ridiculous. So I think he will have an eye for talent. I think he will develop quarterbacks. I think his offensive system is sound. It's just Jimmy's and Joe's at this point. It's just filling out the Stanford roster, which I think is going to take a couple years, at least a couple years, because this is not a portal program. This is just not it. And look, if they can recruit high school, if they can keep the roster intact, that's going to be that continuity advantage, because Stanford's a great place to go to school, play football, whatever the future holds for Stanford as a program on the West Coast or going to the Big Ten or doing whatever, who knows? But I am confident they hired the right guy to run this program. I just don't think there's a ton fascinating about them this year. Quarterback was Ari Patu or whatever. I'm just not there in terms of finding intrigue with them.
Can we combine our fascinating points into one?
Sure.
The most fascinating thing to me about the Troy Taylor hire is stylistically, Stanford will look much different than they have under David Shaw all these years. Troy Taylor uses more of a spread offense, mixes in some air raid stuff, motion, RPOs, stuff that's very, very different from that power football, right? The fullback, that type of stuff that they've been doing under David Shaw. And the offenses at Sac State were all very balanced. He was good as both a passing offense and as a running offense when he had the guys. It may take a while to get the guys. I don't think he's got them. To your point, it's not a portal school. I'd much rather be Colorado than Stanford right now. No two ways about it.
Sure.
But I think the Troy Taylor hire is interesting. And he's a name that came up for this job before whenever we would kind of talk about rumors. What does the future hold for David Shaw? Troy Taylor is a name that made a lot of sense and still does. So I wish him well. I just think it's going to take a little bit to get there.
Definitely. Same.
Let's talk about UCLA, Dan.
Please.
The over-under is 8.5 for the Bruins this season.
Okay.
I don't know how you feel about that.
They've got a couple of really strong players on defense. Yeah. I like Chip. They did pretty well in the portal on both sides of the ball, which is sort of par for the course, golf term for you, Ty, for UCLA. They added firepower at receiver, but I don't know. The fascinating thing to me with UCLA is what exactly the shuffling is going to look like in that quarterback room with transfer, returning guy, and the first 5-star quarterback of Chip Kelly's career.
Well, I think your point is kind of a sub point to mine.
Okay.
And the broader point of fascination is that this is the next chapter for Charles Chip Kelly. He's now been at UCLA for 5 seasons. It's taken every single minute to turn the tide on the Bruins program. The first 3 years were pretty bad. They were not good. I remember several conversations with you where we were like, is this thing going to continue next season?
Oh, well, there was the element of there was a deadline of extending Chip Kelly's contract that we weren't sure UCLA was going to address. And so
No, and with good reason, right? I mean, the first 3 years of the project were not good.
No.
It has taken a while. It's been a slow build. He had to reprogram DTR. He had to reprogram the offensive line, get everyone playing a little bit differently. But there was that point during the COVID year, 2020, when it finally kind of took, and UCLA's offense improved dramatically. It's been improving ever since. Last season, third in offensive SP+. DTR completed 70% of his passes. He had 39 total touchdowns. So at least to that end, the reprogramming of DTR, it was pretty damn successful for Chip Kelly. I'll say this, at the risk of overgeneralizing, there have been two glaring weaknesses for Charles Chip Kelly since he took over. The first is defense. Last season, UCLA was 89th in defensive SP+, and that was the best defense he's had. Okay? There's not been a good defensive unit. He has struggled with defense in his time in Westwood. They've just been really bad on that side of the ball. I think he made a really good hire with Danton Lynn. That in and of itself is a risk because Danton Lynn's never actually run a defense before. But worst case scenario, they're probably like back to where they've been. So I think it's a high upside hire, even though there's a fair amount of risk with it. The second bit of it is recruiting. The second glaring hole for Chip Kelly has been high school recruiting. They've been good in the portal. Mm-hmm. They've been able to convert guys from the portal and get a lot out of them. But nationally, over the last 5 years, they've averaged 35th in terms of their recruiting class. And that seems a bit amiss given where they're at.
Sure.
Given where they're located. They're in a hotbed for recruiting. The fact that they haven't been better is definitely something of a black eye. That's where it gets interesting. That's where it gets interesting and why I say next chapter, because this season could go an awfully long way towards patching up that recruiting hole. UCLA flipped Dante Moore from your Oregon Ducks.
Yeah.
Last recruiting cycle. He is the top quarterback prospect to ever sign with UCLA. He's the favorite to win the starting job at time of recording in late July. Who knows what happens?
Right.
There are other competitors, Colin Schlee notably, but it seems as if it's Dante Moore's job to lose. It's actually quite rare that we get to see Chip start a Chip guy, break in a new Chip guy. This guy has literally, Chip Kelly has literally never had a bad quarterback in his time.
Are we sure it's not Ethan Garbers? Is that a thing?
I don't think it's going to be Ethan Garbers either.
Really?
He was the presumed starter at kind of the beginning of all this before the Dante Moore news.
I don't think it's going to be Schlee, but okay.
I don't think it's going to be Schlee either. I think it's going to be Dante Moore.
Wow. Okay.
I think it's going to be Dante Moore. I'll hitch my wagon to that.
Okay.
If I'm wrong, I'm wrong.
Okay.
But the reason it's so fascinating to me is if Dante Moore comes in, if he follows in the footsteps of every other Chip Kelly quarterback and ends up being really good, schedule's very favorable. This seat might maybe the easiest in the Pac-12. And success breeds success. Success for Dante Moore could mean that there's a domino effect on the recruiting trail and more guys want to come to UCLA. The caveat is just that there's a lot of new at UCLA. You can talk all you want about what Dante Moore brings to the equation as a quarterback and how the schedule is favorable and how Chip Kelly has reprogrammed and made things more physical, yada, yada, yada. But there's a lot new. They lose Zach Charbonnet. They lose Jake Bobo. They lose Casimir Allen, 3 starters along the line. They supplemented well. They brought down guys like J. Michael Sturdivant from Cal.
Yeah.
Kyle Ford from USC at wide receiver. 2 linemen that come in from Purdue and ODU. They should again be physical up front, which I think is the key to the whole operation. But there is a question. There is a question about how much new can this system tolerate and how much new is too much new if they're trying to move forward into this exciting new chapter. I could talk about Danton Lynn. I could probably talk till I'm blue in the face about Danton Lynn. But the defensive question, frankly, is not new. It's not really even that fascinating. It'll be fascinating if they turn things around in a year. We can talk about it in the offseason. But the point of fascination for me is just that this is a new leaf for Chip Kelly at UCLA. If he can install an exciting new quarterback from the jump that gets results, what does that mean for the project moving forward? What does that mean for the immediate future? Because again, over under 8.5, I think the schedule is fairly easy, fairly workable relative to their peers in the Pac-12. So if this thing goes really well, they hit the over. If it proves to be too much new, then it's a different conversation altogether. And maybe we're not quite as bullish on what this means to the overall project and recruiting and did they patch it up or not. But I remain very optimistic about where things stand right now. And I'm I'm hitching my wagon to Dante Moore.
Did you watch Succession?
I did.
UCLA fills that part of my heart that says, UCLA, I love you, but you're not serious people, right? Like,
why? Why is that?
If Chip Kelly wanted to build a 10-win team around Dante Moore, he would have. He would find ways to build up the UCLA recruiting program and operation to recruit top 20 classes to Westwood and not rely exclusively on the portal. I don't think UCLA is serious about
what is the problem in the recruiting department, though?
That Chip has decided that he'd rather take defensive ends from North Texas or Bowling Green than Texas or Arizona. Like, he has a big name. He had an old assistant. I mean, not an age reference, but like, he goes way back with Jerry Azzanaro, who he employed forever at UCLA at defensive coordinator. He had an older staff that wasn't meeting the recruiting grind requirements of 2023 for a long time. He's gotten younger now, and UCLA is a kind of a difficult place to recruit to because it doesn't have the history of USC. So if you want to go to college in LA for a major program, you go to USC. But Chip Kelly has an incredible history as a head coach, and he is not an aggressive recruiter in the mold of a 2023 aggressive recruiter. So you say maybe Dante Moore is the first domino to fall and people will follow him. I think Dante Moore saw an opportunity to start right away and play in the Big Ten while still leaving the Midwest. And even still, Dante Moore could just leave in a year, Ty.
No, he could.
He could just leave in a year. If he's
but
not
Chip Kelly's
happy,
got
if
a
he's
pretty
not
good
starting,
track record.
He's
Chip
got a
Kelly's
great
got a really good
track
track record with quarterbacks. And if things go marginally well, I think he'd be foolish to leave. Who knows what the other possibilities are in the era of the transfer portal.
But do you think the roster on offense that is presumably built around Dante Moore, if Dante Moore is CJ Stroud or Bryce Young or any of the recent lethal quarterbacks we've seen, 5-star caliber quarterbacks we've seen in the sport, if Dante Moore is what the youth are saying, is him, Ty.
Yeah.
That's what the youth are saying, right? That's the Gen Z thing.
Sure.
If Dante Moore is him, is he surrounded by like-minded and similarly talented players at UCLA? And is there a track record of Chip Kelly surrounding him with the Dante Moore of left tackles, the Dante Moore of tight ends, the Dante Moore of receivers? I say no.
I mean, I like what they've done in the transfer portal. I think they've been aggressive, and I think Chip has hit more often than not. I think he's
he's a great coach.
Been very good at working the portal, and he's certainly a good coach. He knows how to coach quarterback, knows how to coach offense. I think it's a fair question, though. I mean, where does this receiver room, where does this offensive line rank relative to peers in the Pac-12? They're like 5th or 6th best. You know, we're not talking, I don't think, about a team of killers here.
No.
Right now, next to Dante Moore. I think there's a pretty good chance it's going to take a while. If it happens, it's going to take a while. And I just find it fascinating that the next chapter for in some sense, historic college football coach could hinge on the success of a true freshman.
Yeah.
That's where I'm at.
And it's about to get harder in the Big Ten.
Exactly.
Okay, who do we have left? ASU?
We have ASU and we have Wazoo.
Yes.
Let me address ASU quickly.
Please do.
Arizona State, I landed on the motto of 5 for fighting, Dan.
Oh my God, what a reference. Sure.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why. Their over-under's 5, so maybe that has something to do with it. But I find myself the most interested in things that I just don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to talk to someone in Vegas about how Arizona State's over-under is 5 wins. It confuses me to the
You're
point of
thinking more or
fascination.
fewer?
Oh, I'm thinking fewer.
Yeah, me too.
Arizona State's schedule is absolutely brutal. They play the top 5 teams in the conference. 3 of those games are on the road. They're starting with 5 losses. In that sense, they're starting with 5 losses, which means they got to go 6-1 against Southern Utah, Oklahoma State, Fresno State, Cal, Colorado, Wazoo, and Arizona to hit that over. I'm not feeling bullish about their opportunities there. Those aren't all great teams, but the Arizona State roster from last season was fully nuked, basically starting from scratch this year. The defense is 115th in returning production, figures to be a huge liability, especially against the top tier teams that they have to play. Offensively, I'm not sure what the plan is. They're solid out wide, but everything else is a question mark. It's so bad that I'm starting to come around on the decision to bring in Drew Pine. And that's saying something because I can't stand Drew Pine. I never could.
Right.
It's just not good. It's not good. It is not a good situation at Arizona State. It could get good. I know Kenny Dillingham is very excited about the opportunity, and he made much to do about going back home, about this being the dream job. He's employed a coaching staff that's very familiar with the state of Arizona. Arizona is not a state void of talent. So if he can get that thing cranked up, more power to him. He's young, he's vibrant, he's energetic, he's coached offense at a very high level. Good on him. It's not going to happen this year. It's just not going to happen this year. The over-under is interesting to me, though, because of the Gump factor that we discussed. Washington, a week after Washington plays Oregon. Utah at home, a week after Utah plays USC and Oregon, back-to-back. And a week before Utah goes to Washington. They play UCLA a week before UCLA plays USC. I can rattle through the list here.
Sure.
There's a whole bunch of scenarios that are interesting on the ASU front. But the fact remains this is a basically new roster, and they are starting from scratch in many regards. Will we get to see Jaden Rashada? I don't know. Jaden Rashada, of course, the big commit that they got, I guess, via Florida after he decided to back out of his letter of intent. And so that's your quarterback of the future. Will he be the quarterback of the moment? They've got enough options in that quarterback room that I don't know. We'll see. I'd like to see him over Drew Pine. I'd like to see him over, Jacob Conover or some of the other options that they've got.
Right.
Trent Bourguet. Like, we'll find out what direction Kenny Dillingham wants to go in the immediate future. But Jaden Rashada is the future. And they've got some decent pass catchers, but it's just not enough for me. It's not enough. I don't blame Kenny Dillingham for any of this.
No.
I don't blame ASU for hiring Kenny Dillingham. How could you? It's just, it's a tough situation now that they're fully stripped down to the studs, and the schedule seems highly unworkable for a program that is starting from where they're starting from.
I also don't love this staff. There's a couple of intriguing guys, but I don't love the assistants that he built up. Like, quarterback room is obviously, it's just going to be a pathway to eventually starting Jaden Rashada, whether that's this year or next.
Right.
But no, there's just not a lot on this roster that pops. Bringing in a bunch of transfers on both sides of the ball, but I don't think there's star power on either side of the ball to any sort of reasonable degree. So no, I think it's going to be, because of the schedule too, an extraordinary learning curve. The time it's going to take to fully get to anywhere near what Kenny Dillingham's vision is for this program. He's recruiting all right, but early returns aren't incredible. So give him time. I'm just not in on
five. Five is the over-under, Dan.
I don't
five is the over-under.
I'll pull up the schedule.
I don't understand it at all.
Could certainly lose to Fresno and Oklahoma State, SC, Cal on the road, Colorado at home. There's just nothing gimme here other than who's week one?
Southern Utah.
No, man. It sort of has 2-10, 3-9 language about it that, if they catch people situationally in a good spot, in a sandwich spot, sure, believable. But otherwise, no, I'm not there.
Final team is Wazoo.
Yes.
My point of fasting, I'll beat you to the punch here.
Please.
Ben Arbuckle taking over the offense. Young Ben Arbuckle from Western Kentucky, focusing on the vertical passing / tempo combination that is, I guess, a pretty stark contrast from what Wazoo had been doing, which was a lot of horizontal stuff to the flats.
Sure.
It'll be interesting to see how Cam Ward does in that system, Dan. I tried to research Cam Ward a lot last season when he came over, and there were questions about the deep ball and the mechanics and the lower body and some of the minutia that doesn't translate well to podcast audio. Wazoo's over-under is 6.5. There is this new offense that is exciting. It's a good coach in Jake Dickert. Wazoo either by virtue of being in Pullman or by virtue of being, one of the schools that we tend to bring up below that top rung in the Pac-12. Frankly, it's a school that often gets overlooked as well. So where are you at with Wazoo? What's your point of fascination?
I think they're feisty, right? They're changing things on offense, which is good because I didn't love their offense last year. I'm still not a huge Cameron Ward guy. I have the written down that like all aboard Cam American Airlines, excuse me. So it's not great. I'm the first to admit it. But look, they're starting from a point of promise at quarterback and definitive production and talent at edge rusher, which is really a great starting point. Now, they lost a bunch of assistants. I think their defensive coordinator just went to Arizona State, Brian Ward, I believe. They lost a receivers coach who was taking over at North Texas, I believe. So they start over at a bunch of spots, both offensive and defensive coordinator, along with a number of position coaches. They're decimated by the portal on both sides of the ball, receiver included. And so they're turning more to tight ends now, and they're going to take deeper shots now. All great to hear in late July. I don't think they've got guys on defense otherwise. Outside of a couple guys rushing the passer, they are thin, man. And so the best that they can hope for is feisty performances, being overlooked, whatever, but I see them as being bowl-ish. Like, it's just tough to change that much year over year. And it's good that you got the quarterback back, but like, I don't know, who's he throwing to? Right. Like, who is putting the fear of God into like the USC secondary, the Oregon secondary, the Washington, the Utah secondary? Like, how are you actually taking advantage with Cameron Ward? And so that to me is the issue.
Yeah, I mean, outside of Colorado and Stanford, which obviously have their own roster issues to contend with.
Yeah.
I mean, Wazoo is maybe next worst. Maybe Oregon State's a little bit worse than Wazoo in terms of pass catchers.
Maybe.
That's a real question if you're going to run a vertical offense.
The schedule's okay to me because Colorado's at home, Stanford's at home, Arizona's at home, Oregon State's at home. Even like new look Wisconsin's at home, and they win that game last year at Camp Randall, obviously a different circumstance for the Badgers. I think they can get to that bowl level. To get beyond it, I just don't think they have the pop to do so. How old were you when you got your driver's license, by the way?
16.
Was Ben Arbuckle born? Are you 16 years older than Ben Arbuckle?
It might be close to that.
Oh, my God.
Quite. It's not quite that. He might have been 1 year old.
So, at the very least, Ben Arbuckle is not potty trained.
No.
When you are coming into your own.
That's right.
As a 16-year-old. Oh, man, we are old. I mean, you're a generation ahead, but we're still old.
Just throw that one in there.
Yeah. I think they'll be fine. I think they'll be fun. I just don't know if fun wins you 8 games, 7 games. That's Pac-12. Who do you have winning it?
I think I'm on Washington.
Over who in the championship game?
I think I'm Washington.
It's divisionless.
It's divisionless. I think I'm Washington. And I think I'm probably USC.
Washington over USC in a rematch because they play each other, right?
Yeah, I think I'm Washington, USC.
Washington plays USC back to back after or a road game after road Stanford. Yeah. Before Utah, Oregon State. So it's in the thick part of their schedule.
It's tough though. It's tough. I can make a very, very easy case for Oregon. I can make a very, very easy case for Utah. Utah should be the easiest case. Again, I prefaced all this by saying I'm doing it again with Utah.
Yeah, I understand.
I'm remaining skeptical. I think it's a tough schedule, and I do have some questions about their ability to kind of come out of the gates 100%.
Right.
And I really like Washington. I really like Washington a lot. Washington USC could be fun as hell. So I'm going to go Washington as my Pac-12 winner.
I'm going to go Oregon, Washington in the championship game. And I'll go, I'm back and forth because I like SC a lot too. I'm going to sleep on Utah because one of us has to. Okay. That's just, if we're going to keep this going, somebody has to sleep on Utah. I'm going to sleep on Utah, and I'm going to say, I'll stick with it. I'll go Oregon, Washington rematch. Oregon wins the conference in a homer pick.
Let us know your thoughts. Solidverbal@gmail.com as ever is the email address. Sign up for our Patreon at verballers.com and play Grand Total.
Total.
Pick the over-under of every Power 5 team. The winner gets a Solid Verbal prize pack. Again, that's at verballers.com. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Follow the podcast on your app of choice. If you're watching out on YouTube, hit the subscribe button there as well. Obviously, reviews and comments and star ratings are always greatly appreciated, Dan.
Agree.
That's all I got. My voice is dying here talking all things Pac-12.
I loved it because at one point you sounded, I think you were talking about UCLA, and you tripped up.
It just died.
And you went, it's like you got something touched a nerve, and you're like, and they might only win 10, win 5. And it was great. It was like, oh my God, this emotion out of nowhere.
It killed me. Those folks are your 23 most fascinating things about the Pac-12.
That worked out well.
In 2023, we didn't even plan that.
But now we have to come up with 23 for every other conference now. We've set the bar.
For that guy over there, my good friend Dan Rubenstein, for myself, Ty Hildenbrandt. Next up, the Big 12. Talk to you soon. Stay solid.
Peace.